It's kind of you to invite me. I understand some people thought I was going to talk about the book I'm working on at the moment about drones, but actually I'm not going to talk about drones. I'm going to talk about a controversy within the anthropological community about a US Army system called the Human Terrain System Program, which caused a lot of debate in the media and within anthropology in the last few years. And I'm positioned very interestingly in regard to this debate. I was one of the most visible protagonists in the debate, but I'm going to try and sort of step outside that role and do a sort of meta-analysis of the debate and why it was that the anthropological position on the ethics of this program turned out to be almost entirely inaudible outside our profession, and especially. So the Human Terrain System program was initiated in 2006. At its height, it cost about $160 million a year. At its height, there were 27 human terrain teams, 10 in Iraq, 17 in Afghanistan, with about 5 to 9 people on each team. The teams were led by military intelligence officers, but they included 2 or 3 social scientists, which were ideally to be anthropologists. These people would go around the countryside, or sometimes urban settings, talking to the natives and giving advice to military commanders based on what they found out. These days, the program has shrunk a lot. Obviously, there are no human terrain teams in Iraq. There's maybe 4 or 5 left in Afghanistan. When the US is withdrawn from Afghanistan, there will presumably be none. In case you think that that means that the idea of the human terrain system is dead, that is not the case. AFRICOM has been very taken by the concept of human terrain teams, though it's learned to rename them to reach the concept of some of the controversy. So AFRICOM calls them SCRATs, Sociocultural Research Action Teams, but it's the same basic principle. So although the Army program is in trouble and may actually be closed and defunded, the concept itself has embedded itself in the military bureaucracy, has gone viral and threatens to be practiced all over the world. And there are some of those SCRATs I mentioned under AFRICOM supervision in Djibouti right now. This is Montgomery McFate, anthropologist with a PhD from Yale, married to someone from US Special Forces, and she was the architect of the idea of the Human Terrain System program, persuading the Pentagon to fund this program. As she described the purpose of the program, it had 4 main purposes. One is what I'm calling Emily Post stuff. You know, if you're a US military officer or an infantryman in Afghanistan and Iraq, the people there behave differently. You know, they don't like to shake hands with their left hands. Hand signals may mean different things. This in Iraq, when you hold your hand up like that to a car in Iraq, it means come on through, which is why a lot of innocent families were shot dead at US checkpoints in Iraq. So one purpose for these human terrain teams was to explain the local etiquette to people and hope that US military personnel wouldn't commit so many faux pas. To explain on local cultural practices, an Afghanistan human terrain team did a now legendary report on what's known in Afghanistan as man-boy love, which is the practice of older Afghan men taking boys as young as 12 or 13, dressing them up as girls, having them dance for them, and engaging in sexual practices with them. By our definition, this is pedophilia. The Human Terrain System program advised the US military, you know, don't think of this as pedophilia. This is the local practice. You should have respect for it. Just leave it alone. Human terrain teams would respond to specific requests for advice as commanders prepared for meetings with village elders and so on. And they would write lots of reports mapping genealogical, political, economic, and religious identities and relationships. Now, the critics of the program also argued that they were gathering targeting information, and they often argued that whether they were deliberately gathering targeting information, they were gathering information which, once fed into Pentagon databases, would become targeting information, whether the social scientists who gathered the information intended it that way or not. But once US military analysts looked at the information, they would look at it with a particular eye. And I'll give you an example. A human terrain team social scientist found that many villages with very high proportions of widows supported the Taliban. And this was because they had no male providers. And she had a benign intention in finding this. She suggested that the US military come into these villages and provide for the women so that the Taliban wouldn't have an opening to provide for them instead, and suggested that the villages could be taken out of the conflict if the US military would go in and look after families. In the eyes of US military intelligence analysts, you now know if you want to look for villages where there are likely to be lots of Taliban, you look for villages where there are lots of widows. Right? So the same information can be reframed. This is someone called Tracy, a human terrain team anthropologist in action in Iraq. And I should say that when this photograph was published by Newsweek, it caused a visceral revulsion for many anthropologists. The idea of an anthropologist in military uniform engaged symbolically in the conflict. Okay, so in late 2007, the program had its media rollout on the front page of the New York Times. David Rhodey, who wrote this front page article, said, and I quote, "In interviews, American officers lavishly praised the anthropology program, saying the scientists' advice has proved to be brilliant, helping them see the situation from an Afghan perspective and allowing them to cut back on combat operations. The aim, they say, is to improve the performance of local government officials, persuade tribesmen to join the police, ease poverty, and protect villages from the Taliban and criminals." Nothing there about helping the US to find Taliban insurgents and kill them or anything like that. It's very sort of benign stuff. Same article says, Colonel Schweitzer, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division unit, working with the anthropologists here, said that the unit's combat operations had been reduced by 60% since the scientists arrived in February, and that the soldiers were now able to focus more on improving security, healthcare, and education for the population. So this is the core of the case for the Human Terrain System program. It increases, and this is a liberal case. It's not a conservative, let's kill the Taliban case. It's a liberal case. It increases cross-cultural understanding, harm reduction. You'll have fewer casualties. Instead of killing people, you build bridges to them by understanding them. So you substitute soft power for hard power, and you do more development work. And by doing that development work, the locals like you and they won't support the Taliban. So instead of going door to door, beating people's doors down and killing people, you engage in this kind of soft power initiative, so you don't have to kill so many people. And so Americans and Afghans, or Americans and Iraqis, can get along together. So the case was particularly made by the liberal interventionists and the liberal interventionists within the US military. It was also often made by people who claimed to have opposed the invasion of Iraq and to have opposed the war in Afghanistan. So I once had Montgomery McFate herself say that she had been opposed to the war in Iraq, but the war was happening. It wasn't going to end, so what were you going to do? Why not engage in harm reduction? Have fewer casualties, make it a softer, gentler kind of war. And this liberal case, for a liberal form of counterinsurgency, waged by social scientists and anthropologists, was very widely accepted in the mainstream media, especially the New York Times. On the other hand, the American Anthropological Association, shortly after that New York Times article came out, issued this statement. The executive board of the American Anthropological Association concludes, one, that the HTS program creates conditions which are likely to place anthropologists in positions in which their work will be in violation of the AAA Code of Ethics. Two, that its use of anthropologists poses a danger to both other anthropologists and persons other anthropologists study. Thus, the executive board expresses its disapproval of the HTS program. Now, disapproval may sound like a very mild word. It's actually about the strongest word that the Anthropology Association could use. We're not like the American Medical Association. We don't have the power to throw people out if they violate our ethics code. That is, believe it or not, as high as the volume goes in condemning by the way, after that statement came out, although you could earn $200,000 a year as a human terrain team social scientist, although the job market in anthropology at that time was just about the worst in living memory, recruitment of anthropologists to the Human Terrain System program basically dried up. By the time it was at its height, there were 4 or 5 card-carrying anthropologists. Everyone else had degrees in religious studies, sociology, music, culinary studies, believe it or not. Very, very few real anthropologists. This is a quote, I'm not going to read it to you, but this is a quote from a commission report. This is a commission that was appointed by the president of the American Anthropological Association to investigate the Human Terrain System Program and see what anthropologists should conclude about it. And it ends, the commission suggests that the AAA emphasize the incompatibility of HTS with disciplinary ethics and practice for job seekers. The commission members, by the way, of that commission, just in case you think it was stacked with liberal anti-militarists, it included Kerry Fosher, the resident anthropologist for the US Marines. It included Laura McNamara, a resident anthropologist at the Sandia Nuclear Weapons Lab. I know her personally. She consults extensively for the CIA. And Laurie Rush, the archaeologist for the US Army. They absolutely consent on that statement in the previous slide. So this is interesting. It doesn't matter whether these anthropologists work for the national security state or not. They completely agreed that the Human Terrain System Program should be off limits for all anthropologists. And the reason that they agreed on that is because of our ethics code, which I'm about to get to in a minute. This, by the way, is a letter to Congress from a group called the Network of Concerned Anthropologists. I am one of the 11 founders of the Network of Concerned Anthropologists. As soon as the program began, we started collecting signatures on a pledge from anthropologists not to participate in HTS. We got over 1,000 signatures in just a few weeks. This was a campaign we did the following year, a letter to Congress asking them to cancel or defund the program. 6 of 9 living former presidents of the Anthropology Association signed that letter. 38 distinguished chairs of anthropology signed it. 49 department heads, 22 elected officers of the AAA, 10 journal editors, and over 600 unique signatures of anthropologists in 2 weeks. This is just to communicate forcefully to you that there was something close to a near complete consensus in the discipline that anthropologists should not participate in this program. So why? It comes back to our ethics code. The ethics code had first been written, we lost it, in 1971. It's since been revised by a commission that I headed. It was born from abuses in the Vietnam War, but it has advisory status. Just so you know, you can't throw anyone out of the association for breaking it. The main precept of the code is do no harm. So the primary ethical obligation that anthropologists have is to the people they study and the people with whom they work. And the code is very clear that if you've been doing research with people and you think publishing your research might harm those people, you have a responsibility never to publish, even if it costs you tenure, even if it costs you a job. Your primary responsibility is never to broadcast any information about the people you study that could hurt the people you study. Compare that with this person, Audrey Roberts, human trained team anthropologist, who said to a journalist, if it's going to inform how targeting is done, whether that targeting is bad guys, development, or governance, all I'm concerned about is pushing our information to as many soldiers as possible. The reality is there are people out there who are looking for bad guys to kill. I'd rather they not operate in a vacuum. So in other words, she's quite happy to feed targeting information to kill people in the communities where she's been doing interviews. Completely at variance with what 99% of anthropologists would understand by our ethics code. And Lieutenant Colonel John Gentile said anthropologists shouldn't fool themselves. These human terrain teams, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, in a generalized and subtle way, do at some point contribute to the collective knowledge of a commander, which allows him to target and kill the enemy in wars like Iraq. So to anthropologists like Ms. McFate, they should stop sugarcoating what these teams do and end up being a part of. To deny this fact is to deny the reality of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Informed consent. The ethics code insists anthropological researchers should obtain in advance the informed consent of persons being studied. The executive board of our association said, HTS anthropologists work in a war zone under conditions that make it difficult for those they communicate with to give informed consent without coercion, or for this consent to be taken at face value or freely refused. As a result, voluntary informed consent, as stipulated by the AAA Code of Ethics, is compromised. So imagine the anthropologist arrives, surrounded by military personnel carrying M16 rifles, and they say, would you like to chat with the anthropologist? You know, that is not an ideal fieldwork situation where people feel free to decide not to chat with the anthropologist. And then there's the obligation to other anthropologists. Anthropologists should do all they can to preserve opportunities for future field workers to follow them in the field. The reputation that anthropologists got of being tools of the military has already proved to be damaging. There's one anthropology PhD student I know who was incarcerated in Turkey for a while, a year after the HTS program began, on suspicion of conducting espionage. And disclosure. Anthropologists should not withhold research results from research participants when those results are shared with others. This is from the AAA Ethics Code again. The point of the Human Terrain program was not to give back the information to Afghan villages or people living in Baghdad. The information only went to military databases. It was never shared with the people from whom it was collected. So a violation of a normative practice in anthropology. So, to wrap this up, I presented two different ways of looking at the HTS program in two different ethical frameworks. The liberal interventionist ethical framework is one that follows a consequentialist logic. It said, look, cross-cultural understanding is better than no cross-cultural understanding. And this program may result in fewer people dying. So it's a good thing to do. The anthropological community didn't look at it in those larger consequentialist terms. It looked at it in proceduralist terms, in terms of its own ethics code, and decided that the program was very dangerous to our ethical integrity. What we discovered during this debate, such as it was, is that the position of the Network of Concerned Anthropologists and the Anthropological Association was almost entirely inaudible to people outside the American Anthropological Association. There was extensive media coverage of this program and of the debate within the Anthropology Association about the program, and our ethical position on the program was almost never registered by the journalists who reported on it. Instead, they glossed opposition within the Anthropology Association as being political correctness. The people who were against the war, therefore, didn't want anthropologists to participate. Now, many of the people who opposed the program were against the war, but the beauty of the proceduralist approach to thinking about ethics is that even anthropologists who were in favor of the war also opposed this program because it so clearly violated our ethics code. And I had many experiences at dinner parties of sitting next to liberals who were against the war, who at the end of half an hour would tell me that I was an idiot for saying that anthropologists should not participate in the Human Terrain program because, as they saw it, it would reduce casualties and it would make the world a better world. So, the turn towards thinking about this in terms of professional ethics, I think, was valuable within the anthropological community in that it kept our community together. We never had to have a divisive debate about whether the American Anthropological Association was for the war or against the war. We could always bracket that question and agreed to make this a sort of technical question in terms of our ethics code, and therefore reach pretty near consensus, not participating in this program. But there was a cost to this, which is that it made our critique of this program completely inaudible to the rest of the world. Most people never even heard the critique or read about the critique in the media, and even when they did come across it, it made no sense to them. So I guess my larger point would be that in situations like this, and the Psychological Association found itself in a similar situation around the ethics of engaging in torture at Guantanamo. The medical profession also found itself in a variant of this sort of position. The specialized ethics code of a professional association may be unintelligible to people outside. And so, in closing my last slide, what I wonder actually is whether the Anthropology Association might not have been better off if it wanted to be heard by the rest of the world to mount its own consequentialist critique of the Human Terrain System program. So the program is now widely acknowledged to have been a complete dismal failure. And the reason for that is that they could never recruit specialists in Afghan culture or Iraqi culture. These anthropologists were working through translators in a cultural context that they did not understand. So they didn't have the language skills, they didn't have the area expertise, and they were trained that if they talked to any single person for more than 10 minutes, they could be shot dead by a sniper. So they should confine their conversations to individuals to 10 minutes. Now, I am used to having 4-hour conversations with individuals and not feeling that I understand the cultural context unless I've spent many, many hours with someone without a translator. Right? So you send someone with a degree in culinary arts who doesn't speak the language. You tell them only to speak to someone for 10 minutes. They go back and they sleep on a military base instead of sleeping in the village with the people they're studying. That's the first principle of anthropology. You share the subject position of the people you're studying. It is a joke to think that these people will bring back any useful knowledge of any kind. So in retrospect, I guess the missed opportunity that I regret is that we did not communicate through the media to the American people. This program was a complete waste of taxpayers' money. And whether you were for the war or against it, whatever the American Anthropology Association's ethics code said, it was doomed to fail in practical terms.
Thanks, Hugh. And now finally with Rich Rubenstein.
Well, I want to first thank Dan Rothbart for arranging that storm yesterday so that I could come today and follow Hugh Gusterson and the other panelists, and also be here on the same day as Allison and Sarah, whose paper you may decide that mine is a kind of bookend to theirs, because it really deals with some of the same issues and deals with them in something like the same way. Also want to thank Hugh for being too polite to call attention to our own professional behavior when it comes to the equivalent of human terrain programs. And I will come to this a little bit later in this short talk, but I cannot resist saying, just in the light of what he's just said, anybody wonder what the United States Institute of Peace was doing in the Green Zone in Baghdad during the invasion and occupation of Baghdad? Anybody wonder why they refused to hold a forum on alternatives to invading Iraq? Is that right? Yeah. Anybody wonder why they have been holding dialogues between members of the Syrian opposition, but don't seem to have had any interest at all in holding dialogues between the representatives of the regime and members of the opposition? Our own profession has no code of ethics, and this may be an indication that we ought to think about one. But let me get to that in due course. I started out with a title drawn from a polemical essay of Trotsky's called Their Morals and Ours. I did that partly because it's relevant and partly because I like to say Trotsky in public. Trotsky had been criticized for advocating violence on behalf of workers. When he said violence on behalf of the owners and the owner's state wasn't justifiable. He responded that, in this essay, which is, by the way, worth reading and easily available online, he responded that he didn't deny that there were moral norms that might be applicable to people as people in their capacity as members of a human society, but said that the character of these norms was, to use his words, rather arithmetic and indeterminate, because of necessity to apply these general abstract principles to specific contexts. For example, the context of class warfare. So he concludes in this quite nasty essay, which is fun to read. Whoever does not care to return to Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, whoever is not satisfied with eclectic hodgepodges, must acknowledge that morality is a product of social development, that there is nothing invariable about it, that it serves social interests, that these interests are contradictory, that morality, more than any other form of ideology, has a class character. And so I want to apply that to our situation without necessarily defending Trotsky's views on a class struggle, although I happen to agree with them. I want to apply it to our situation by going back to Galtung and structural violence, which in many ways is a starting point for us. Whenever I think about Galtung and think about this essay, I always think of his appearance, quite dramatic, at John Burton's Human Needs Conference in 1989, when Burton had assembled in one room a lot of the heavy hitters in our field. And several people talked about basic human needs and the importance of satisfying them if we wanted to avoid violent conflict. And Galtung got up when it was his turn and said, I'm here to discuss basic human needs. I think they exist and I think they need to be satisfied. But unless, I'll never forget this, he said, unless you recognize the essential difference between the Herren and the Knecht, between the lord and masters and the underlings, or those in the essay itself he calls top dogs and underdog, you won't understand why human needs aren't satisfied. Human needs aren't satisfied because of structural violence. Because elites operate the systems that they control in such a way as to systematically deny the satisfaction of the human needs of people who aren't in control. Just using that as a starting point, then, I want to ask the question, what are the ethical implications of that position? If structural violence leads to cultural violence, as Galtung argued, and both of them lead to direct violence, which justifies us using the name violence to describe a kind of fairly wide variety of phenomena. Then the implication is that in order to get rid of the violence, or at least to lower the sum total, we need to do something to transform the structures that are producing it. So system transformation then becomes a logical goal and an ethical imperative for people interested in lowering the amount of structural and cultural and direct violence. Well, it seems to me that following that logic, there would be you might be led to embrace three ethical maxims. Right? First, analyze the system to determine what is the relevant social structure which is generating the structural violence, and precisely how it generates the violence. So the first maxim is analyze the system. The second, for a conflict resolver, avoid becoming part of the system that's generating the violence. Serve the parties in conflict, not the system. And third, develop practices which lead in the direction of system transformation and an end to structural violence. Practices I want to describe in a minute quickly. Two come to mind. One is social constitutional dialogue. Another is system re-envisioning. Let me comment quickly on each of them. Analyze the system. Analyze the system, it seems to me, means first of all recognizing that what the relevant system is and how it's operating to produce violence is not obvious. It requires analysis. It's not obvious, and it may be a highly contested notion. I would argue, for example, that if we concern ourselves with the particular domestic conflict, domestic as well as transnational conflict between criminals and law enforcers, cops and robbers conflict, that analyzing the system clearly would require that we look at the socioeconomic system in which a job is a privilege rather than a right. A minimum decent income is a privilege, considered a privilege rather than a right. Normal unemployment is considered to be 7%. and people who don't have jobs or decent jobs, who don't have a decent income, have little choice but to engage in criminal activity. If you're going to try to analyze crime without looking at the broader system, or if you think that the way late capitalism is operating in this country and some other countries is not a germane system, then, well, fine. I mean, then we can talk about that. But it seems to me then there is no way in which you're going to be able to resolve the cops and robbers conflict. What you can do, if you're a conflict resolver, is to engage in practices which are certainly defensible and which do some good, such as restorative justice practices, victim offender reconciliation, and other, etc. Prison reform, whatever, other such practices. But then don't say you're practicing conflict resolution. You're practicing conflict management, because you're not dealing with the system that's generating conflict. And don't say you're into alternative dispute resolution. You are into adjunctive dispute resolution. Soft power that Hugh mentioned before is the equivalent in political practice, in foreign policy practice. You're helping the system run better. You're helping it maybe to be a little more humane. What you're doing certainly is not, I don't mean to condemn it. I think victim offender reconciliation is a great idea. But it has nothing to do with eliminating the causes of crime. If we were to try to do this right now, this is not something that we really teach yet, you understand, but we're getting around to it finally, thanks to Sarah and some other people who are, Mark, who are drawing our attention to the need to learn how to analyze systems this way. But in order to analyze systems this way and to say exactly how are they producing this violence, which is not an easy matter, we need to be able to draw on the learning and experience and insights of people from other fields. In this case, perhaps criminology, certainly sociology, certainly psychology. And I just want to point out that in order to equip ourselves to do this, this means keeping this field open to infiltration by people from other disciplines. We originally grew and developed some of the field's greatest insights by bringing in people from all over the place, from the other social sciences, from religious studies, from law, from, you name it. And if we stop doing that, if we become kind of hermetic, it seems to me, if we start saying, well, the first requirement if you're going to get a job in this field is that you already be in the field, that we may be condemning ourselves to perpetuate our ignorance of how these systems operate and how they can be changed. Secondly, the imperative to avoid becoming part of the system means, it seems to me, that we begin to think of ourselves as a profession and an academic discipline which was created in relationship to a knowledge power field, the way our friend Foucault suggests, and ask ourselves in a painfully honest way, what's our relationship to power as a profession? And what's happening in the field? Without belaboring the point and going on, I've already given you some indications about the way I believe the institutions like the U.S. Institute of Peace, which were originally created, as I understand it, to be brokers between the field and the government, have in fact simply become the government, at least when push comes to shove. And how, simultaneously, at the same time, the kinds of support that we got from public-spirited citizens and more or less neutral foundations has dried up over the years. In part, perhaps, as John Burton used to say, because you couldn't tell the real conflict resolvers from the charlatans. And as a result of that drying up, the only game in town is government money for research and government jobs for students. This is not an argument that people shouldn't be employed, and it's not an argument that we can ignore economic reality. It is an argument that if there is not countervailing force, if there's not a push in the direction of trying to create an independent base for our field, both financially and I will have to say also politically, that we're in clear and present danger of being taken over by the government. What that would mean would be we would be debarred from analyzing systems and doing anything about systems if those systems are being operated by or in the interests of the government. And the same thing, of course, it seems to me will be true in terms of nature. Companies, and the same thing will be true in terms of other governments or even of international organizations. That is to say, maintaining the independence of the field is difficult, but it's ethically required if we're going to portray ourselves as conflict resolvers. If we're going to say we're going to make the world a little safer for US-style democracy, or we're going to try to give imperialism a human face, fine. But if we're more morally ambitious than that, if we're really interested in getting rid of, in radically decreasing the amount of structural violence, then we have to worry about our independence, not so much because it's, I'm not just talking about my politics, but because it's impossible to resolve conflicts while working for one of the parties. That's why Johan Galtung won't accept any money from any parties to a conflict, and other people, Tatsarai won't either. And other of our graduates somehow, through great difficulty, trying to maintain this independence, because they think their effectiveness depends upon it. And finally, if we're talking about re-envisioning systems, if we're talking about putting ourselves into position to do the kind of social constitutional dialogue that Iraqis and Syrians are dying by the thousands and thousands because they have not had that opportunity to talk to each other and decide what kind of country they want, as opposed to the kind of country the United States wants, or Russia wants, or their powerful neighbors want. If we're going to do this kind of work, we're going to have to, it seems to me, overcome our aversion to politics, or the pretense that we're apolitical, and learn to study and practice not the old politics. The old politics is a creature of the system. Every system has political methods designed to maintain it in the same way as Thomas Kuhn tells us every scientific paradigm has methods designed to maintain it. So the question that then arises that we need to, I think, to get about answering is what would constitute a constructive, transformative new politics? And part of that, I think one of the reasons Sarah's center is so important, is that part of that is what kind of language, what kind of narrative would be consistent with such a new politics. The reason Mark Gopin's center is so important is what kind of spiritual practices and what kind of religious organization would be consistent with such a new politics. That, of course, I think that's what makes our field so, it may be difficult, but it's what makes it so exciting and ultimately so promising.